we now have some time for a discussion. And I'm very pleased that I'm joined by Annalisa Pires, the film director. Annalisa is a film director, a writer, and a journalist. She has written for newspapers, and also she's worked in TV and produced a number of very interesting documentaries. We are also joined by a panel of experts who will help us unpack some of the issues, looking at them from different perspectives. I'm joined by Sophia Besch over there. Sophia works at the Center for European Reform, where she's a research fellow, and she focuses on European defense issues. I'm also joined by Dr. Jessica Hagen-Zanker from the Overseas Development Institute. She's also a research fellow there, and she leads the migration research portfolio there. And lastly but not least, Steve Valdez-Simmons from Amnesty International UK, where he is the Refugee and Migrant Rights Program Director. Before I open up for questions and comments from the audience, I have a few questions of my own that I'd like to pose to our panelists. And I should have said that this is on the record. I will start with Annalisa. Annalisa, you've been given unprecedented access to the High Representative Mogherini. And so you were really able to witness all that goes on behind the scenes of EU policy making. What struck you the most? Was there anything that you had never thought of before that you were able to observe while you were doing your research? If there is that one thing that you took away.
There were a lot of things that struck me, and I realized how little we really know about the European Diplomatic Service. I mean, it has been in place for not long. It's a new institution, but it is extraordinary how much it could be more important and more present in the mind of European citizens, because we really have no idea. And it is a very important institution. It represents the biggest economic bloc in the world, 500 million citizens, and yet we know very little. The thing that struck me the most is the intensity and the complexity of the issues that they deal with, and by contrast, how little this is understood by the public, and also how interesting it is that it is a diplomatic corps. But as someone mentioned in the background, not on the record, actually they do the contrary of what diplomats do. Because while diplomats normally deal into protecting information and using information nationally, they do exactly the opposite. They gather masses of information from all the diplomatic research of the 28 countries, and they try to use it to advance the collective interest.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn to our panelists, starting from Sophia. So Sophia, how has the EU defense policy and indeed ambitions developed since the EU global strategy was adopted? What's most noticeable?
Thanks. Thanks for having us. And also thank you so much, Annalisa, for this amazing film. I really think it's a great piece of work. It tracks such an important moment in time.
That's good to know, because not often interviewees of the film like themselves in the film. So it's very good coming from you.
Briefly, and so I could close my eyes and enjoy the rest of it. Right, so EU defense since then. I think what really has happened is that the EU, Federica Mogherini and her special advisor, Nathalie Tocci, they did all this work, they did all this thinking leading up to 2016, and then it was galvanized by, as the film says, Brexit and Trump. That's really when the political will came together to make something out of this global strategy. And what have we seen since then? We've seen a soup of acronyms. We've seen very many EU initiatives focusing on defense, PESCO, the Defense Fund, and others. But what do they focus on? They really focus on capabilities. And I think that's an interesting development, because it sort of points to this split between the EU and NATO when it comes to responsibilities. And that's a split in responsibilities that is developing right now. But for now, what we're seeing is that the EU is inventing itself as sort of the capability provider focusing on its internal single market structures, focusing on the money that the Commission can provide to incentivize capability development, and leaving NATO to do the operations. That's not really a sustainable split, because the other thing that keeps coming up is for NATO to focus on the East and the EU to focus on the South. And this is really where I think this film gives us raises so many questions that we should talk about. Look at Libya, for example. Look at how Operation Sophia has developed from a CSDP, so a defense and security operation, really to a policing operation, because they couldn't really go through with as the film says, the third and fourth stage of this operation, which is to go into Libyan territorial waters and to really seize the smuggler boats there. And that points to this strategic culture that is still prevalent, I think, among many European countries, that is very reluctant to intervene, that is very reluctant to actually go into these. I mean, the situation in Libya is a result of an intervention and then no follow-up, right? And I think there is this great reluctance coming from this to then do anything there. And the latest development, thus, is the French proposal for a European intervention initiative, which is happening outside of EU structures. So this is an initiative that France wants to do together with the UK and Spain, possibly Italy, those countries who still have an interventionist culture, but they want to do it outside of the EU. And that's something that Mogherini and her team see very critically.
Thank you. Jessica, if we can turn to you. I would like you to help us to look at the other side of the coin. Let's look at this from the perspective of the migrants. What impact are EU policies and efforts having on people's decision whether to leave their countries and attempt to reach Europe?
Yeah, great. Also, Annalisa, huge congratulations from me, and I
Thank
really enjoyed the film. I learned a lot. I was scribbling things down in the dark all the time. Hope I can read it afterwards. Yes, I would like to talk about the policies that were part of the so-called migration crisis, and basically challenge the assumptions behind these policies by looking at how they really affect people's behavior. First of all, I would like to say that the migration crisis is maybe not so much a migration crisis, but a crisis of policies, because as we know, migration as a whole, if we look at global levels, has actually stayed more or less constant. Most of it is south-south migration, most refugees flows are in developing countries, so it's not so much of a crisis towards Europe. What we have seen, and this is my first point, is that actually alongside this perceived migration crisis, we've actually seen a more restrictive environment in terms of legal pathways. And what has happened is that this has led to substitution effects. So, for example, we've seen an increase in irregular migration alongside this decrease in legal pathways, which also makes sense. We've also seen decreases in returns, we've seen decreases in mobilities, which are all behaviors that make sense if you think of it in terms of the perspective of a migrant. The second policy I'd like to think about is if migration policies can be pull factors for migrants. And Mogherini actually talked about this in the film. She talked about Operation Sophia and said this is not a pull factor. I think many European countries do perceive that some of their policies could potentially be seen as pull factors. For example, policies on labour market access or welfare, or for example, asylum recognition rates. These are all assumed to be pull factors for migrants. And in the research that we've done and research that others have done, we've shown that it's a lot more complicated than that. And that, yes, some migration policies might have some effects, but what we found is that they're more likely to lead to diversion to other countries rather than prevent migration flows altogether. So they don't change migration in the absolute sense. These are not the reasons why people come to Europe. And again, what we find is when it becomes harder to come through formal legal migration pathways, when borders are closed down, people find other routes which are often more insecure, and as a result of that, the mortality rates of migration to Europe have actually increased steadily over the past few years. And then finally, the third policy narrative that I'd like to challenge is the one about tackling root causes of migration. And I would like to say that it's not as simple as that. So what we know from the migration literature is that when a country develops, migration actually increases over time. So it's not the case that if you just increase aid to some of these countries, as is suggested at one point during the film, migration rates will go down. Also, if you look at it on a micro level, a lot of these programs that are now being rolled out throughout Africa don't necessarily tackle labor market needs. They don't meet, they don't coincide with the skills of migrants or potential participants. So they're ineffective and don't necessarily produce aspirations to migrate. I just like to conclude by, so Mogherini made a remark towards the end, we need to manage migration together, and I would agree with that. But I think we need to migrants need to be a part of that, and I think if we don't consider how migration policies actually trickle down to the micro level, how they change people's behavior, what kind of incentives they create, these policies which are targeted at potential migrants are not going to be effective.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if we look at migration flows, we are now talking about the starting points of the migrants. We have, of course, talked about the end point, so Europe and the perspective for Europe. What is missing is the bit in between, i.e. those countries that start off as transit countries, or they may actually end up being the receiving countries. And on this, I'd like to bring in Steve and actually tell us a little bit about how the countries, the transit countries, or the countries that are neighbors of conflict regions are dealing with these challenges, and how those challenges compare to the challenges faced by Europe.
Well, if I can firstly just add my congratulations to Annalisa on the film. It's a fascinating insight to how Europe perceives, or many in Europe perceive, what is happening around the world. I think your question, in a sense, highlights the importance of thinking outside that and thinking of other perspectives, not least because the countries that we're tempted to talk about as transit countries are not, strictly speaking, transit countries. They are destination countries. You know, far larger numbers of people have moved, are moving to the sorts of countries that we're talking about, whether we're referring to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, neighboring Syria, whether we're looking at Uganda, Ethiopia, neighboring Sudan and South Sudan, whether we're looking at Afghanistan as borders with Iran and Pakistan, Bangladesh, obviously, with a huge movement most recently of Rohingya. And you can look elsewhere. So one of the things that it's very easy to forget, and there is a sort of a moment in the film which is very sort of classic in terms of sort of showing how Europe sees what's going on, but hides so much. And that was the flow of the map. I don't remember all the red arrows all pointing upwards and moving upwards, arriving in Europe, as if the world's population is all heading with one single objective to come to this particular continent. And, you know, from my perspective, it's madness to look at that way. That's not what's happening at all. Indeed, even when we look at Libya, we know that very large numbers of the people that are making the journeys to Europe now move to Libya as a destination country. They move there to work. They were hoped to, and had for some time, many of them, been working there, sending remittances back, doing very much more in many ways than the sort of international aid that is often discussed about in terms of supporting families and extended families back home. So we have to understand that this migration issue is not a European issue. It's a global one. It's hugely complicated. The one thing that, before we sort of open up, that I wanted to flag in relation to the film, though, that sort of struck me, was that a theme, I think, running from many of the commentators, certainly Mary Calder, but I think many others, including Federica Mogherini herself, is this importance of legitimacy. And, you know, we have an international world order that in many ways is built upon a legitimacy around international legal and international human rights standards, and we are very much in danger of seeing that washed away by responses to particularly migratory movements. Rather than sort of giving loads of examples, I'll just think of one. A few years ago, something extraordinary was happening in Turkey. Turkey was rapidly becoming a country that had very, very few refugees, to shooting up the international scale to becoming the world's largest host alongside Jordan. And what did Turkey do? For the first time in the history of Turkey, it developed an asylum system. It was on the verge of joining the international community, essentially signed up to and practicing international human rights norms. That is all unraveling at pace, indeed, along with many other of Turkey's commitments to international human rights standards and the way it treats not just migrants and refugees, but of course its own citizens now. And we have on the border of Europe an extremely unstable state, both within its borders and indeed externally, as we see happening in northern Iraq and Syria, and the risk again that Turkey changes from being remarked upon from Europe's perspective as a host of refugees, but for actually being another source of refugees as it was when I first started working in this particular area.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions and comments from the audience. If you would like to make an intervention, just raise your hand and wait for me to call on you. Anais, please. And if you could please identify yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noel Hedgemichael, and I'm somebody who works at the House of Commons, so it's good to see something more inspiring than the normal thing I see every day. Firstly, thank you very much, Annalisa, for a very powerful production. What I am interested is to ask the panel, but in particular yourself as director, with retail politics being so volatile, and I'm thinking of the Italian election results most recently, what do you fear or what do you see as the risks involved in European democracy playing a negative or a very neutral role to responding to these challenges?
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions at this stage? No? Oh, yes, Anais, just here, the gentleman over there. Paul.
Yeah, Paul Milley from Chatham House. I work mostly on the Sahel, and I wanted to sort of back up the point that Jessica made about the refugee and migration situation. It is much more complex than consumers' outside image would think. So that very often, for example, the largest producers of migrants in West Africa are actually the countries that are economically successful: Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and so on. The numbers who come from Mali, for example, are relatively rather smaller. So the whole question of push and pull and what leads people to want to leave and why they look for opportunities is very, very complex. And the thing that does strike me that's interesting about the West African situation is that because you have regional organizations, the G5 and ECOWAS, and governments that actually are now engaged in some sort of dialogue with Europe about how the crisis or the phenomenon of migration may be managed, it would be interesting to know from the panel how you feel Europe can respond to that, because one certainly gets among West Africans a feeling very often that if some legal channels were opened up, even if they were quite small and limited in number or quite specialist, this would make it easier to sell to their domestic public the concept that migration has to be managed at all. Whereas if there's a completely closed door, it's much, much more difficult. And we saw under the Sarkozy government in France, they closed off one of the traditional avenues of legal migration from Mali. And of course that's completely counterproductive, and it undermines development. And since there was a labour shortage to which the Malians were responding, it doesn't even serve the French economy either. So I'd be interested to know what members of the panel feel about how Europe could develop a response. I mean, especially if Mogherini can buy the political space for something to be done, what should it be?
Thank you. And a lady at the very back. over there, Annalise, and then we can come back to the panel.
Hello, my name's Helen. I'm from the International Rescue Committee. Agree with all the comments about reframing the debate, but I'm quite interested, given that you had such close access to Mogherini herself, and I was really struck by the beginning of the film when there were intimations that not only because she's a woman, but because she's young and inexperienced. And there was a comment, I think, particularly from a British commentator, that actually they really should have put someone in much more experienced with much more political capital. So obviously this is slightly a PR exercise for her, but I thought showed her in a very good light. I'm interested in what you thought your observations were of her political capital and her ability to work across a broad range of countries and interests.
Okay, thank you. I'll now turn back to the panelists. Annalisa, would you like to go first and address the ones that are
I'll try to answer. The three questions are all very, very interesting and would demand a long time to be answered in full. I'll try to be as quick as I can. Thank you for your question. That's a very important question. It's so crucial for all Europeans. What is happening is surreal, is a paradox. So basically, as the complexity of the challenges to European societies become more difficult to tackle, more demanding a common collective solution, the politics are going towards very simple populistic solutions which are going to make things 10 times worse. That's very, very clear when it comes to immigration. Italy has just suffered a disastrous electoral result, which was mainly driven by the phenomenal pressure that migration from Africa is having on the country, and yet the solutions that this winning party propose are going to make things worse. They're trying to make people believe that you can build a wall in the middle of the Mediterranean and stop these people from coming. How do we respond to that? I mean, it was part of my motivation to make this film, to try to put as much as possible of the big picture, of the complexity, and show how the solutions can only be at a European level. So information, education is key to try to explain people, look, what you think is a simple answer, the populist, the racist, the nationalist answer, is going to make your life worse. But I'm afraid to report that apart from very few exceptions, notably in Germany, the media, the national media, are just going towards the direction in which national politics are going. So I guess that there is a huge urgency for civil society, for people who are involved in any way, as you are yourself, in legislative activities, to try to push for more information, more public spaces, debates about this, because the trajectory is frankly terrifying.
Would you like to say anything about Mogherini's political capital, of your assessment of it, rather?
Okay. What I've been shocked by is the amount of misogyny and sexism that surrounds her at all levels. It's transnational, it is from all kind of people that I have asked comments about her in all, along these 2 years. And that's a big problem. That's a big problem because she's doing, in my view, a phenomenally important job. And in the 3 years that she has been in place, I think she has managed to gain a lot of credibility and respect. She's been very effective, very prudent on a media front. So she's very shy, so she's not shouting from the roof. But she's been doing a consistent, steady work in the background. She has covered a lot of different dossiers, mainly in defense. She has made huge advances, but also in terms of, well, the Iran nuclear deal owes quite a lot to her. Forbes declared her the 5th most important woman politician leader worldwide, but still she suffers from lack of interest from the national media, that somehow don't see her as politically relevant because she's not part of the national debate, but actually she is very, very important. And again, I think that there is a lot to be said about feminist diplomacy and female leaders. She's doing a lot, she's doing well, she's a young woman, so she should be, in the year of Me Too, she should be actually celebrated. She's most often ignored and very often vilified.
Steve, would you like to comment?
Well, I'll comment a little bit on the sort of the European response. I think that there is an urgent need, just more generally, for political leaders, for media as well, for all sorts of public spokespeople and commentators to just calm down in their attitudes about migration and immigration. And I'm afraid if that doesn't happen, then we'll continue to see some of the driving of some of the root causes, in fact, of some of the movement that is displayed in the film. I mean, it's interesting to reflect that the relationship between European states and the Sudanese regime, until very recently, was a very clear one in terms of there was a brutal leader whose only focus really from European capitals was to bring that man in front of the International Criminal Court to be prosecuted for international crimes. International crimes which had led to mass displacement of people and still do. Now, that regime is courted by European governments as potentially a regime that can assist in slowing or preventing movement in sub-Saharan Africa and ultimately to Libya and across to the Mediterranean. Well, that is not solving one of the parts of the world which there is huge instability, has been for a long time, and where there is still huge forced displacement of people. I guess in that sort of wider issue around immigration and European attitudes to immigration, they've got to face up to the idea that Europe's relationship with migration cannot be said to be simply about attracting relatively wealthy, well-educated professionals. I mean, if you talk about the immigration policy in this country, but it's reflected elsewhere, you talk about such things as the brightest and the best, as if all we need are these IT professionals, these wonderful bankers, doctors, no doubt, and lots of highly skilled technical people. Actually, our economies are fueled on huge migration, if you want to put it in those terms, I suppose, of much more ordinary individual and very lowly paid individuals, and we still need those people. And until we respect that, I suppose, we're unlikely to respect the sorts of migration that certainly is still needed to not just come to Europe, but is needed in terms of the relationship between Europe and supporting economies elsewhere, not least by the enormous amount of remittances that still support very large numbers of people and their families and communities all over significantly the much poorer, less stable world.
Yeah, I'm going to respond to your comment, Paul, which I think will actually also build on yours, Steve. So I think the economic evidence is just so clear, and we all know that legal migration, regular migration benefits migrants and their countries of origin, but also definitely the host communities. And we know there are huge labor gaps in all aspects of the labor market. And legal pathways are definitely the way forward. They're the way forward because these gaps need to be filled. They're the way forward because otherwise we know people will come through irregular means. And that means that host countries will benefit less because taxes aren't paid. But it also means that migrants will benefit much less. And the poverty reduction potential of migration is just so much bigger than it could potentially be. There are actually lots of models of different legal migration pathways that can be looked at, including, for example, seasonal or circular schemes, which also encourage returns to to the origin country. And having these programs steadily in place and having people being able to rely on them also means that they return, for example, when jobs are not there, but then they know they can come back when work is available again. So being able to depend, knowing these channels are there is hugely important to prevent irregular migration. I think a second thing that's also really important, and that's also something that you touched upon, is looking at these regional migration initiatives, which are in place, but currently often quite weak. And we know that much migration is actually within the global south, and people often don't want to travel far. So if these kind of initiatives which exist on paper but don't really work in practice can be strengthened, that's also a way to increase development, to reduce poverty, but to, let's say, reduce flows to the global north too.
Yeah, just briefly to your question, which I think is one of the most important ones that we're facing today, which is this question of how do domestic politics influence our external policies, our foreign policies. And I've only spoken before about the sort of political will galvanizing effect of Brexit or Donald Trump. Of course, it also has a huge detrimental effect as to what the European Union countries can do together when there is this populist element there. And we see that in the debate over migration and security and defense. We see that very clearly. There's been interviews with Mogherini and others talking about how Central and Eastern European countries in particular would like to invest. They would like to interpret this idea of defending Europe as defending Europe from migration, right? So you invest into the technologies to build a wall. You invest into technologies to stop migrants at the sea or at your borders, and that is of course not what she wants to do. That's not what other European countries want to do. But that's a compromise that she has to somehow balance. It also means that it's going to be much harder. The transatlantic relationship, which I keep coming back to because I don't think we can talk about European defense without talking about NATO, it's going to be very difficult for centrist governments to cooperate with countries that are being seen as led by a populist. So we see that in the example of the relationship between Berlin and DC today, where Angela Merkel is really struggling to find a way that is domestically accepted by her opposition parties and by her population to cooperate with Donald Trump, which is something that all Europeans have to do from a security perspective. So I think this is a really important point. And then just very, very briefly on Mogherini and her political capital and her credibility, because I think it's sort of an underlying theme in this film, and I think it's very cleverly done because you don't really say it out loud, but of course it's there throughout the whole film. And I've really observed that the conversations around her and again her advisor Nathalie Tocci have changed a lot throughout the process of the global strategy and the follow-up, because they have over-delivered. They have been much stricter and much more disciplined than I think anyone would have expected them to be in this process of bringing all member states together. And this idea that came out, and I think it was Nigel Inkster's comment, that they deliberately chose someone who was seen as weak. They deliberately chose someone who they didn't think could make any nation state do what they didn't want to do. That was the attitude pre-2016. That was the attitude of the EU not being the right institution to intervene in defense and security policies. And now that that attitude has changed, I think there's a window of opportunity for her to really gain credibility.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we have 4, and then I will really have to close because we are running out of time. First is Nick.
Thank you. Nick Crawford, Research Associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Kind of following up on Sophia's question, how sophisticated do you think how significant rather, do you think the global strategy is? Are there any demonstrable successes of the strategy? Has it made member states' own strategies any more coherent? Do you get the sense that perhaps by virtue of it being a collection of member states, that the EU's strategy and policy tends to be slightly a matter of catching up on certain global issues? in terms of concepts like stabilization, which have really been only added to the EU's agenda more recently. And relatedly, how far-sighted do you think that strategy is? To what extent is it just responding to immediate challenges that they face? And to what extent is it looking further ahead at the challenges from, well, most obviously Russia, but also engaging with other countries and contesting other countries' strategies where they challenge the EU's interests?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's Seyhan Mohammed, a student of politics and IR. With the surge of far-right parties, with the surge of far-right rhetoric across Europe, operations like Operation Sophia is possibly fueling up the nationalist rhetoric that Europe is taking in more refugees, and which led to Brexit, a main core issue of the Brexiteers. Now, don't you think that politically less controversial decisions like establishing de-escalation zones or buffer zones in the conflict area itself would help the refugees and would potentially be more helpful to the existential political crisis that is at the heart of the European Union?
Thank you. Also in the last row,
if I could also just add my thanks, Annalisa, for a film that was, I think, both far-reaching in scope, but also maintained a very coherent narrative. I think it was an excellent piece. My name is James Pannell. I work for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association over in Westminster. However, a couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to work on the global strategy on behalf of the Dutch Foreign Ministry and the Hague Institute for Global Justice. And a lot of our work focused on something which was lightly touched upon in the film, the idea of homegrown radicalization and the importance of grassroots community intervention in addressing that. And I was just wondering if the panel thought that this was something that needed to be addressed in a coordinated manner, whether it's even possible to coordinate grassroots. It's hard enough to coordinate top table, high level coordination, or do you think it's more something that needs to be decided by those communities and the grassroots individuals most involved?
Thank you. And the very final question, the lady.
Thank you. My name is Carol Berliner and I come from a small NGO called Security Women. May I add my congratulations to Annalisa for a very enlightening film, and thank you so much for all your efforts in bringing it to us tonight. I represent an organisation which is advocating for greater women's participation in peacekeeping, policing, the military, cybersecurity. And so I am most dismayed to hear Annalisa's view or determination that there is much misogyny within the EU and in this sphere. My question to the panel, I'd love to hear from all of you, is whether, or how important is it for women to be part of the macro questioning, or the macro strategy that is Frederica and her people? Is it going to make a difference for there to be further involvement by women? And secondly, on a micro level, I was dismayed again, I suppose, to see that the military and most of the people in the film were male. There was one Nigerian policewoman, so she was like the token female who was doing her bit in this space. I would be very interested to know if you think that women can play an important part in that micro level as well as the higher strategic level.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll now come back to the panel, perhaps in reverse order, starting from Sophia. That's all.
Yes, if that's okay, I'm going to pick and choose and,
of
just
course.
and answer, I think, the EU global strategy question. Look, so the EU global strategy is a diplomatic document, and it is, as by its name, a compromise. And so it does not say very much. I think what it really does is, it distinguishes itself from the previous European strategy, which was a security strategy, under Solana, which was, I think, called a more secure Europe in a better world or something. So really showed a very different time. And I think what they wanted to do with this document is say that the EU is adapting to the new situation that we live in by calling it a global strategy. And what they mean with global is not just geographic, but also throughout different policy areas. So not just security, but also development, also economic, all of these different aspects of it. Secondly, I think something that comes up a lot in the statements of Mogherini and the people involved in the strategy is the word humility. So they wanted to really take a step away from the democratization idea that was at the heart of the 2003 strategy, especially when it comes to Africa, when it comes to regions of the world where the Europeans, following the Americans, have taken a different stance in the past. But then in terms of what has actually happened, and now bear with me because I'm going to go into the bureaucratic aspects of defense, but what happened after the global strategy very quickly was a defense action plan, and what happened after that was the Security and Defense Implementation Plan, and what happened after that was PESCO, the European Defense Fund, the MPCC, which is the headquarters in Brussels, and a couple of other, the CARD initiative, the Coordinated Annual Review for Defense Initiative, and all of these, I'm not going to go through all of them, we can do that later, but all of these show clear results already, particularly the European Defense Fund, which is really the European Commission getting involved in defense. And the European Commission is the institution that has the money and the power. And this is what I think anyone who is interested in this should focus on, because they want to, in the next MFF, in the next multi-annual financial framework, the next EU budget, they want to, for the first time, spend EU money on defense. They want to spend EU money to incentivize countries to collaborate on capability development. And so there have been real concrete results from the EU global strategy.
I'm also going to pick one comment to Mohammed's about Operation Sophia and if that fueled populist movements. I would say these operations themselves didn't necessarily fuel these kind of movements. I think two other things did. One is the media reporting of what was happening at the time, and also the way these operations were being used by politicians. So in terms of the media reporting, I think it's very clear that a lot of the media at the time was reporting this as if the numbers are much larger than they actually are, through the use of photos and provocative headlines and such. Also in terms of the way that politicians use these operations. For example, I think the one before Sophia was Mare Nostrum, or it was a couple of search and rescue missions before Operation Sophia, and that one was being used in the UK policy discourse to justify to withdraw funding from Mare Nostrum, and there were a few high-level politicians that made comments along the lines that these kind of search and rescue missions act as pull factors without having any evidence to support that.
Well, I'll firstly pick up on the other aspect of Mohammed's question, which was about buffer zones and de-escalation areas. I think there's a lot of talk about that at various times. I think the truth is that unless you're able in the region of conflict to very quickly secure an area that is going to be safe and secure, and possibly coupled with a response to conflict and crisis that is going to be sufficient to actually think that that conflict and crisis itself is going to be sufficiently short-term, then you've got a bit of a problem. I mean, certainly we think about, by the time anyone was talking about realistically secure zones in Syria, it seemed to me that that situation was so far out of hand that it was just unfeasible. And there have been similar sorts of comments made about the situation in Libya at various times, which have always struck me as being extremely bizarre, given just how complicated, chaotic the situation is there. So I'm not sure how realistic oftentimes many of those suggestions are, which is not to suggest that there's no place for that in relation to particular conflict and crisis. But the starting point really is a question of sharing responsibility. And if you're talking about major crises with large displacements of people, particularly across borders, leaving the likes of, I don't know, Jordan, Lebanon, for example, to deal with a huge displacement of what overcame what was until recently the largest refugee population in the world by national origin, being Palestinians hosted in those two countries as well as Syria and in the region, then it's just not really a realistic approach. It's one that's actually hiding the issue, I think. It's one that's trying to shift any issue of responsibility sharing, including through hosting. Very quickly on the couple of other questions, because I'm not probably sufficiently expert to say a great deal, but it does seem to me that whether you're talking at macro or micro levels, not just women's participation for that matter, the participation of black and minority ethnic peoples. I mean, it was noticing in the film, which is not a criticism of it at all. I mean, it very fairly reflects the politics, but did we see one black voice that had any element of power or ability to comment on what actually was going on? We had the police officer, I think she was from Niger. And yes, I mean, she was talking about the very small little thing that was going on for her, but that was really something that in many ways was being done to her, perhaps for her, but certainly wasn't a comment about what was going on around her and what her part in that bigger piece was. So yes, whether we're talking about radicalization or we're talking about migration movements or indeed defense, I'm sure there's a huge opportunity to have many more voices than staid, white, middle-aged, middle-class professional people like me. So, yeah, definitely more voices. And I'm sure that's very hugely important in terms of your radicalization point as well. If you're not going to engage and empower the communities in which radicalization does or doesn't happen, then I'm afraid the sort of more distant voices, again, perhaps like mine, they're probably more likely to harm than hinder, I would guess.
I must confess that I've forgotten the question. No, not all of them. So let me answer to the lady here, because that question is particularly close to my heart. The role of women in conflict zones and how they can help. There is a lot of material that didn't make it into the film, but Professor Mary Kaldor has done enormous, excellent work on that. And she, and I believe she's convinced that there is so much more that we could do in involving women in conflict zones. And she especially quoted the work that has been done in Iraq, where local communities led by women were absolutely key in working with the American forces in enforcing local ceasefires, borough by borough. So when women are given a chance in war zones to work for peace, they do miracles. The problem is that very often in all kind of war negotiations, there are no women sitting at the table. There are only the warlords. So this is something that needs to change, and this is something that is part of the global strategy. Again, I agree with Sophia that the global strategy is a compromise diplomatic document, so it lacks details. But on the other hand, it has phenomenally important benchmarks and key ideas that probably will not be implemented tomorrow, but they are there now and they cannot be completely forgotten. And the role of women is one of them. I mean, like someone told me behind the scenes in diplomatic circles, probably we won't go much farther than the global strategy in the next few years, but we won't go backwards. So this is the hope. And what else was there in terms of important question? Well, the role of local communities, again, is very, very important. And the Netherlands have done and are doing a lot of important work in Libya with the mayors there. And that's proving very, very, very effective in, again, establishing legitimate form of authority that stop the guns, that establish ceasefires. And in Italy, there has been a very successful experiment in local communities against radicalization. So that is all very, very good lessons learned that should be shared more at the European level.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid that we greatly overrun, but I thought it was worth carry on with the discussion. I think both through the documentary and through your interventions and the answers, we were really able to challenge some of the commonly held beliefs that we hear when we discuss migration policies. And I think that in itself is a very valuable exercise, and we should be doing more of this.
Absolutely, more of this. And if I may just add something, Virginia, because we believe that it's very, very important to bring this film to wider audiences, we have created a campaign which is called the Wake Up Europe campaign, that invites people to organize their own screening for free of the film. So if you have any ideas for locations or communities that could want to do it, just let us know. Thanks.
Okay. Well, can I also just before we close say that if you're interested in the work of Women in International Security UK, WISE UK, we do a social once a month and lots of substantive policy events and workshops like this. You can follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. And the next social is going to be on the 26th of March in the Bank of England pub, and you're all welcome. Bring a friend.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that's all we had time for. Well, thank you again on behalf of ISS and WISE UK for joining us tonight, and I hope to see you soon. But before you leave, please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you, Virginia.